The forest was older than memory, a place where even the most daring hunters refused to venture after dark. Locals called it the Whispering Woods, not for the sound of the wind in the trees, but for something far more sinister. At night, soft, unintelligible murmurs would drift from the depths, carried on the cold breeze, laced with fear and malice. Logan had heard the warnings 1,000 times. Stay out of the woods after sundown, they'd say. But warnings didn't pay bills, and the bounty offered for retrieving the lost cargo was too tempting to ignore. A shipment of rare, priceless artifacts had gone missing during transport, its convoy found abandoned at the forest's edge. The only clue was a blood-stained note pinned to one of the wagons. It took them. We dared not follow. Logan wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Armed with a flashlight, a map, and a revolver he barely knew how to use, he crossed the forest boundary at dusk. The first hour passed uneventfully, though the oppressive silence was unnerving. Even the usual forest sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of small creatures were absent. The trees loomed taller the deeper he went, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The trail was faint but visible, marked by the occasional splash of dried blood. As night fell, the murmurs began. They were faint at first, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. Logan paused, turning in circles as he tried to pinpoint their source. The whispers were everywhere yet nowhere, rising and falling like waves. His heart pounded, but he pressed on, the promise of a hefty payout dulling his fear. The map led him to a clearing where the remains of the convoy stood in eerie stillness. The wagons were overturned, their contents strewn across the ground. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood. As he approached, his flashlight flickered. Logan cursed under his breath, tapping it until the beam steadied. But the whispers grew louder, now sounding like voices, many voices, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of dread. "Who's there?" Logan called, his voice trembling. The forest answered with silence. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Its silhouette was human, but its movements were wrong, jerky and disjointed, like a puppet with its strings tangled. It turned toward him, and his flashlight illuminated its face, or what should have been a face. There was nothing but smooth, pale skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should be. The whispers surged, now deafening, pouring into Logan's ears from all directions. Logan staggered back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The faceless figure cocked its head, as though studying him, despite lacking any eyes. Its movements were eerily fluid now, the jerky stiffness replaced by something almost serpentine. The whispers didn't come from its smooth, featureless face. They came from everywhere else. From the trees. From the ground. From behind him. "Stay back," Logan shouted, fumbling for his revolver. His hands were slick with sweat, and it slipped from his grip. He scrambled to pick it up, but when he glanced up again, the figure was gone. A rustling sound came from the treetops. He swung his flashlight upward, its beam cutting through the thick canopy. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a pale limb disappearing into the darkness above. Logan's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The whispers grew louder, shifting from incoherent murmurs to words he could almost understand. Fragments of sentences swirled around him. "Lost all alone. They belong to us now. Leave before it's too late." And then, louder than all the others, "Run." That single word shattered his paralysis. Logan bolted, crashing through the underbrush, his flashlight swinging wildly. The forest seemed alive, its gnarled roots reaching out to trip him, its branches snagging his clothes and skin. Behind him, the whispers gave way to a low, guttural growl, one that seemed to vibrate in his chest. He didn't dare look back. The trees became denser, their twisted trunks forming a labyrinth that seemed to shift with each step he took. He glanced at the map, but the symbols and markings seemed to writhe and shift, no longer matching the terrain around him. It was useless. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. Logan tumbled down a steep incline, landing hard at the bottom. Pain shot through his ankle, and he bit back a cry. The flashlight had slipped from his grip, its beams spinning wildly before coming to rest, illuminating the face of a body lying just a few feet away. It was one of the convoy guards. Or, at least, what was left of him. His face was frozen in a rictus of terror, his eyes wide and staring. Deep claw marks raked across his chest, exposing bone. Logan's stomach churned, and he forced himself to look away. A soft rustling sound came from behind him. He turned slowly, his breath hitching in his throat. There were more of them now. Figures with smooth, featureless faces, standing motionless at the edge of the light. They were close enough that he could see the faint shimmer of their pale skin, almost translucent under the glow of the flashlight. Logan reached for his revolver, his fingers trembling as he raised it. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. The nearest figure tilted its head, as if puzzled by his words. Then it stepped forward. Logan fired. The gunshot echoed through the forest, impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. The bullet struck the figure square in the chest, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it raised one long, clawed hand and pointed at him. The whispers returned, louder than ever, flooding his mind with a cacophony of voices that drowned out his thoughts. "Join us. It's so much easier to give in. You can't run forever." Logan clamped his hands over his ears, dropping the gun in the process. "No." "Shut up. Leave me alone." The figures began to move, closing the distance with slow, deliberate steps. Their bodies seemed to ripple and distort, as though they weren't entirely solid. Desperate, Logan grabbed the flashlight and shone it directly at them. For a moment, the light seemed to hold them at bay, their forms flickering like a bad signal on a television. But the respite was brief. One of the figures lunged, its clawed hand reaching for him. Logan screamed. Logan scrambled backward, his injured ankle screaming in protest. The figure's claws swiped through the air inches from his face, carving deep gouges into the ground where he had been moments before. His flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as if reacting to the malevolent energy in the air. Logan swung it wildly, the erratic light slicing through the darkness and causing the faceless beings to momentarily recoil. It wasn't enough. The figures pressed forward, their movements quickening. The whispers reached a fever pitch, words blending into a nauseating roar that seemed to vibrate deep in Logan's skull. "Stop," he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "What do you want from me?" As if in response, the figures froze. The whispers ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that rang in Logan's ears. One of the beings stepped forward, its head tilting as it examined him. Then, without warning, it crouched low and plunged its clawed hand into the earth. Logan watched in stunned horror as the ground around him began to writhe and shift, roots breaking through the soil and twisting toward him like grasping fingers. "No. No, no, no." Logan yelled, scrambling to his feet despite the pain in his ankle. He stumbled forward, weaving through the trees, but the forest seemed to conspire against him. The roots tripped him, the branches clawed at his clothes, and the darkness closed in, suffocating and absolute. Behind him, the figures moved in unison, their pursuit eerily silent now. Logan's breath came in ragged gasps as he burst into another clearing. In the center stood something that made his blood run cold. It was an ancient tree, far larger and older than any he had ever seen. Its massive trunk was gnarled and blackened, and its roots twisted outward like the legs of a monstrous spider. Embedded in its bark were dozens, no, hundreds of faces. Human faces. They stared out with expressions of anguish, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Some appeared fresh, their features still distinct, while others were worn and weathered, their faces merging with the bark as if consumed by the tree. Logan stumbled backward, his flashlight beam trembling as it played across the horrific tableau. He tried to turn, to run, but the roots snaked out from the ground, wrapping around his legs and dragging him toward the tree. "No! Let me go!" he screamed, clawing at the dirt. The figures emerged from the shadows, circling him like predators closing in on wounded prey. They moved with an unnatural grace, their faceless heads tilting in unison as they watched him struggle. The roots tightened, pulling him closer to the base of the tree. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle. "You belong here. Become one with the forest. Peace awaits." Logan thrashed against the roots, but they held him fast. His flashlight slipped from his grasp, rolling to a stop a few feet away. Its beam illuminated the base of the tree, where fresh blood seeped from the bark, pooling around the exposed roots. As he was dragged closer, Logan's screams became frantic. "Please, I don't want to die. Let me go." One of the figures knelt beside him, its featureless face hovering inches from his own. For a moment, Logan thought he saw something stir beneath its skin, a faint outline, as though a human face were trapped beneath the smooth surface. It leaned in closer, its voice a soft, melodic whisper that cut through the cacophony. "You are home." The roots surged upward, wrapping around Logan's torso and dragging him toward the tree. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the bark splitting open to reveal a hollow cavity, its interior pulsing with a sickly, organic glow. Then, the forest was silent once more. Weeks later, a team of search and rescue workers ventured into the Whispering Woods, following reports of Logan's disappearance. They found no trace of him, only his flashlight, lying at the base of a massive, ancient tree. One of the workers, a young woman, shone her light on the tree's bark. Her breath caught in her throat as she spotted a face, freshly etched into the wood. Its expression was one of sheer terror. There's a legend in our town about the Hollow Trail, a winding path deep within Blackthorn Forest. The stories vary depending on who you ask, but they all share a common theme. People who wander too far along the trail never return. The old-timers whisper about shadowy figures, cursed ground, and the cries of unseen children that lure travelers deeper into the woods. For most, the trail is little more than a campfire tale to scare kids into behaving. But for my brother Ethan and me, it became something much more sinister. It started with a dare. Ethan was the reckless one, always pushing boundaries. I was the cautious younger sibling, content to watch him from a safe distance. But that night, as we sat by the fire with our friends, Ethan decided to test the legend. "Let's find out what's really out there," he said, his grin challenging anyone to back down. "You're crazy," I muttered, but my protest only made him more determined. The others laughed nervously, but no one accepted his challenge. No one except me. Not because I was brave, but because I couldn't bear the thought of letting Ethan go alone. We left just before midnight, armed with flashlights, a compass, and the bravado of teenagers who thought they were invincible. The woods were alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the distant hoot of an owl, and the rustle of leaves beneath the scurrying feet of unseen animals. The trail was easy to find, marked by a weathered wooden sign etched with the words "Hollow Trail." It looked unremarkable, just a narrow dirt path winding between the trees. "See," Ethan said, smirking. "It's just a trail. Nothing to be scared of." We walked for what felt like an hour, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each step. The air became heavy, and the usual sounds of the woods faded into an unnatural silence. That's when we heard it, the faint, plaintive cry of a child. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Ethan nodded, his expression suddenly serious. "It's probably just some kid who got lost. Out here? At this time of night?" The cry came again, louder this time. It was a high-pitched wail, tinged with desperation. Against my better judgment, we followed the sound. The trail began to change. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The dirt path turned to ash-gray earth, and the air took on a foul, metallic tang. The cries led us to a clearing. In its center stood a dilapidated well, its stones cracked and covered in moss. The sound seemed to emanate from its depths. "Hello," Ethan called, peering over the edge. His voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the darkness below. A cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. I grabbed Ethan's arm. "Let's go."
Now.
But before I could pull him away, something answered. It was faint at first, a soft whisper that seemed to come from the well. But it grew louder, the words becoming clear. "Help me." Ethan froze, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. "We need to leave." But Ethan was already leaning over the well, his flashlight pointed into the void. "It's a kid," he insisted. "We can't just leave them." Before I could stop him, he climbed onto the well's edge and lowered himself inside. I shouted, but it was too late. Ethan disappeared into the well, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness as he descended. The echo of his boots scraping against the stone walls sent chills down my spine. "Ethan, stop. This is insane," I yelled, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, I heard the faint sound of his flashlight clattering against the walls as it slipped from his grip.
"Shit."
Ethan cursed. His voice echoed up to me, strained but steady.
"I'm okay."
"The ground's closer than it looks. There's something down here. I think it's a tunnel. Get out of there," I shouted, my hands gripping the edge of the well so tightly my knuckles turned white. But Ethan didn't listen. His stubbornness was both his best and worst trait.
"Hold on," he called.
"I'm going to check it out." The sound of his footsteps echoed faintly from below, growing softer with each passing second. My flashlight beam barely reached the bottom, where his own light flickered erratically, then disappeared altogether. "Ethan?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I leaned closer, desperate to catch a glimpse of him. "Ethan, this isn't funny. Say something." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, faintly, I heard the cry again. The child's voice. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the well. It was behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the trees. The forest was unnervingly still, the shadows shifting as the light moved. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the clearing, searching for the source of the sound. "Ethan?" I whispered, though I already knew it wasn't him. The cry came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a palpable weight pressing against my chest. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming until I was left in near darkness. I felt it before I saw it. A cold breath brushed the back of my neck, and the faintest whisper filled my ear. "Leave him." I turned, swinging the flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the yawning darkness of the woods. The whisper came again, from everywhere and nowhere. "He is ours now." Panic surged through me. I gripped the edge of the well, shouting into the abyss. "Ethan, get back up here right now." A deep, guttural growl rumbled from the forest, low and menacing. The ground beneath me trembled, and I stumbled back as cracks spiderwebbed across the stone rim of the well. Something was rising from the depths. I froze as a long, clawed hand emerged, its pale, sinewy flesh glistening in the dim light. It gripped the edge of the well, followed by another hand, and then a face, a hollow, sunken visage with empty eye sockets and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. It smiled. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the clearing with a cacophony of voices that seemed to pierce straight into my mind. I ran. The forest closed in around me, the trees forming a maze of tangled branches and roots. The whispers followed, shifting between taunts and pleas. "Don't leave him. You can't save him."
"Come back."
Tears streamed down my face as I sprinted through the woods, my flashlight beam bobbing wildly. The air grew colder, sharper, burning my lungs with each breath. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the forest went silent. I stopped, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees were different now, less twisted, more familiar. I had made it back to the main trail. But Ethan was gone. I told the others what had happened, but no one believed me. The search parties found nothing. No well, no clearing, no sign of Ethan. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. The town moved on, but I couldn't. I returned to the trail every night, hoping for some sign of him. And then, 3 weeks later, I found it. A single item lay at the trail's edge. Ethan's flashlight. Its beam was still on, faint but steady, pointing toward the woods. I haven't gone back. The forest was a scar on the land, a twisted reminder of something ancient and vile. Locals called it Screamer's Grove, and no one ventured near its gnarled boundaries without reason. Even the wildlife seemed to avoid it. No birds nested in its branches, no animals roamed its undergrowth. It was silent during the day and alive with dreadful, blood-curdling screams at night. I didn't want to go there. I wasn't foolish, reckless, or curious. But when my sister Mara disappeared 3 days ago, I didn't have a choice. We lived in Cold Hollow, a town so small and remote that most people hadn't heard of it. Our parents were long gone, so it was just Mara and me in a crumbling house on the edge of town. Mara had always been the adventurous one, but even she had her limits. She knew better than to set foot in Screamer's Grove. At least I thought she did. The sheriff said there wasn't much they could do. People had gone missing before, and the outcome was always the same. Nothing. Search parties combed the outskirts, but they never went deep. The forest had a way of disorienting people, and those who wandered in rarely came out. But I couldn't just sit around and wait. So, on the 4th night after Mara vanished, I packed a bag with essentials, flashlight, food, water, a knife, and headed for the grove. The town was quiet as I left, the few remaining lights and windows winking out as midnight approached. The grove loomed in the distance, its outline jagged against the starless sky. As I approached, the air grew colder, the familiar night sounds fading into an unnatural stillness. The edge of the forest was marked by a low stone wall, crumbling and covered in moss. Beyond it, the trees were packed so tightly together that they seemed to form a solid wall of bark and shadow. I hesitated, gripping the cold stone of the wall. "Mara," I whispered, as though saying her name might summon her back. A scream tore through the silence, raw and unearthly. It wasn't human, it was too high-pitched, too layered with strange harmonics that made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard and stepped over the wall. The forest was worse than I had imagined. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches curling like claws. The ground was uneven, covered in tangled roots that seemed to writhe beneath my feet. I turned on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The air felt heavy, thick with a metallic tang that clung to my tongue. "Mara?" I called, my voice trembling. The scream came again, closer this time. I swung the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing, only the shifting shadows of the trees. I pressed on, following the faint trail that wound deeper into the grove. Every step felt wrong, as though the forest itself was pushing back, trying to expel me. The screams came intermittently, each one louder and more horrifying than the last. They weren't random, though. They formed a pattern, a haunting rhythm that seemed to pull me further in. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a clearing. At its center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk blackened and split as though struck by lightning. The ground around it was bare, the soil dark and wet. "Mara," I shouted, my voice echoing across the clearing. For a moment there was silence. Then, from the shadows beneath the oak, something moved. A figure stepped into the light of my flashlight. It was Mara. Relief washed over me, and I rushed toward her. "Mara, thank God," I stopped short. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unfocused. She moved jerkily, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Her clothes were torn and streaked with mud, and her lips were cracked and bloodless. "Mara?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She tilted her head, her movements slow and deliberate. Her mouth opened, but the scream that came out wasn't hers. It was the same unearthly sound I had been hearing all night, layered and alien. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hands. "Mara, what happened to you?"
She didn't answer.
Instead, she raised one trembling hand and pointed at the oak tree. The bark of the tree began to shift and ripple, as though something beneath it was trying to break free. The screams grew louder, echoing in my skull until I thought my head would split. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, the tree burst open. From the gaping wound in the oak's trunk spilled a thick, black substance, oozing down its bark like tar. It pooled at the base of the tree, shimmering with an unnatural sheen that made my stomach churn. Mara remained motionless, her arms still outstretched, her eyes locked on me with an eerie intensity. The black substance began to move, rising and twisting, coalescing into a shape, a figure. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too narrow, and its skin rippled like liquid caught in perpetual motion. The thing stood there for a moment, towering over both of us, its featureless face turned toward me. Then it screamed. The sound wasn't just audible, it was physical. It slammed into me like a tidal wave, forcing me to my knees. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the ground and casting jagged shadows across the clearing. "Mara," I shouted, struggling to be heard over the cacophony. "Run." But she didn't move. The creature's head tilted, as though considering me. Then, it raised one elongated hand and pointed at Mara. Her body convulsed violently, her limbs jerking as if caught in an invisible storm. The scream pouring from her mouth grew louder, more fragmented, as though it were being pulled apart.
"No."
I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and shining it directly at the creature. The beam struck its featureless face, and for a brief moment, it recoiled, its form shimmering like heat on asphalt. I lunged toward Mara, grabbing her arm. Her skin was ice cold, and her body felt rigid, like a statue. "Mara, wake up. Please." The creature recovered quickly, its head snapping back toward me. Its limbs stretched unnaturally as it advanced, the black ooze trailing behind it like a shadow. I pulled Mara toward the edge of the clearing, half dragging her as my heart thundered in my chest. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and contorting as though trying to block our path. The creature's scream followed us, a constant, piercing wail that made my ears ring and my vision blur. I stumbled over roots and rocks, clutching Mara tightly as she continued to convulse. The whispers began then, soft at first, but growing louder with each step. "Leave her behind. She belongs to us now. There is no escape." I shouted, my voice cracking. "She's my sister. You can't have her." The whispers turned into mocking laughter, echoing through the trees. We burst into another clearing, this one smaller and more claustrophobic. At its center stood another tree, smaller than the oak, but just as unnatural. Its branches were bare, and its bark pulsed faintly, as though alive. Mara's body stiffened in my arms, and she let out a low, guttural moan. I turned her toward me, her glassy eyes meeting mine. "Help me," she whispered, her voice faint and fractured. Before I could respond, the creature emerged from the darkness, its form now twice as large, its limbs undulating like tentacles. It moved with a terrifying grace, closing the distance between us in seconds. Desperate, I grabbed the knife from my bag and slashed at the thing. The blade passed through it like water, leaving no mark. The creature raised one of its elongated arms, its hand splitting into claw-like appendages. I braced for the blow, my body trembling with fear. But then, Mara did something I didn't expect. Her hand shot up, grabbing my wrist. Her grip was impossibly strong, her nails digging into my skin. "Run," she said, her voice layered with 100 others. The creature hesitated, its faceless head tilting as though confused. Mara turned toward it, her body now eerily still. "I said run," she screamed, her voice breaking into the same unearthly wail as the forest. The ground beneath us began to tremble, cracks spreading outward from the base of the pulsing tree. The black ooze that had followed the creature retreated, flowing back toward it like a tide reversing. I stumbled back, clutching the knife, and staring at Mara in horror. "I'll come back for you," I shouted, tears streaming down my face.
She didn't respond.
She just turned toward the creature, her body radiating a strange, flickering light that grew brighter with each passing second. I turned and ran, the forest around me collapsing into chaos. Trees splintered and fell, the ground heaved and buckled, and the air was filled with that same terrible scream. I didn't stop until I burst through the grove's boundary, collapsing onto the cold stone wall. I sat on the crumbling stone wall, gasping for air as the forest behind me grew quiet. The screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. I turned to look back at the grove, but it appeared different now. The trees were no longer twisted and gnarled. The forest was still dark, but it felt normal. I wanted to go back for Mara. My body trembled with the urge to cross the boundary again, but something deep inside me warned against it. The memory of her words, layered with voices that didn't belong to her, rang in my mind. Run. For hours, I sat there, staring into the grove. The sheriff found me just before dawn, his flashlight beam cutting through the early morning mist. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, taking in my disheveled appearance. "Mara," I whispered, my voice raw. "She's in there. She's still in there." He gave me a look of pity, the kind reserved for someone you think has lost their mind. "Kid, we searched that forest for days. There's no one in there." "You didn't go far enough," I snapped, my voice rising. "She's alive. I saw her." But he just shook his head. "I'm sorry. I didn't go home after that. The house felt too empty, too wrong without Mara. I stayed in a cheap motel on the edge of town, nursing the wounds on my arms and legs, replaying the events of that night in my mind. The days turned into weeks, and the town began to move on. People stopped whispering about Mara's disappearance, stopped looking at me with that mix of curiosity and sympathy. But I couldn't move on. One night, I woke to the sound of screaming. It wasn't coming from the street or the rooms next door. It was coming from the woods. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. In the distance, beyond the darkened houses and empty streets, I saw the faint outline of Screamer's Grove. And there, just beyond the tree line, was a light, a faint, flickering glow. Mara. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my heart pounding. I had promised her I'd come back. They never found me. The people of Cold Hollow added another name to their list of the missing, another warning for future generations to stay far from the grove. But the screams still echo in the forest at night, louder and more frequent than ever. Some say the grove takes the ones who are lost, pulling them into its depths to become part of something greater, something ancient. Others believe the screams are a warning, a plea for help from the souls trapped within. But one thing is certain, Screamer's Grove doesn't let go.